I built a bird feeder no bird could ignore. Motion-triggered cameras, individually numbered perches, a feeding pattern designed to be noticed, remembered, and returned to. I expected pictures of wings and seeds. I did not expect what actually happened. Within 4 days, the feeder had visitors. Within 11 days, it had regulars. And by the 3rd week, something impossible seemed to be happening. Certain birds were no longer just eating. They were watching, pausing at the same distance every time, tilting their heads toward the camera lens itself, as if checking whether it was checking them back. That single detail cracked open a much bigger question. Not why do birds visit feeders? That part is easy. The real question is stranger. How much do birds actually know about the individual, specific creature standing on the other side of the glass? About me? Because the deeper you look into avian cognition, the less brain starts to make sense as an insult. Start with the crows. In studies from the University of Washington, researchers trapped and banded wild crows while wearing a particular mask. Years later, crows in that population still scolded anyone wearing that same mask on sight, even people who had never trapped a single bird. The behavior had spread beyond the crows who were originally caught. Offspring who hadn't been born yet during the original trapping still reacted to the mask. Somehow, the information had been passed on. That's not memory, that's culture. My feeder wasn't hosting crows in large numbers, but it was hosting their smaller cousins, chickadees, tufted titmice, nuthatches, and the pattern held in miniature. After about 2 weeks, the bird's approach changed entirely.
They stopped hesitating at the edge of the feeder. They came directly to specific perches, the ones I refilled most often, as if they had built a private map of which locations were reliably worth the trip. Which leads to the first real explanation, and it's a good one. Recognition in birds isn't a vague sense of familiarity. It's built on dedicated neural architecture. Birds process faces and locations using a brain region called the pallium, structurally different from the mammalian neocortex, but functionally doing remarkably similar work. Pattern recognition, memory encoding, threat assessment. Different hardware, comparable software. But that answer only opens a stranger door. If a chickadee can recognize one feeder among an entire backyard, how does it manage its actual survival strategy? Because chickadees don't just visit feeders, they cache food. Thousands of individual hiding spots scattered across a territory, each one visited and remembered separately, sometimes for months. Here is where it gets genuinely hard to accept. A single black-capped chickadee can store food in over 1,000 locations in a single season and recall a meaningful percentage of them with precision, not by scent, not by chance, but by spatial memory. Researchers have found that the hippocampus of food-caching birds is proportionally larger than in non-caching species, and it doesn't just stay large, it grows seasonally, expanding right before caching season begins, then shrinking afterward. Their brain is not a fixed structure, it's a tool that resizes itself for the job ahead.
Try for a moment to imagine hiding 1,000 small items around your own neighborhood, under specific leaves, behind particular fence posts, inside certain gutters, and returning to each one correctly weeks later. Most humans couldn't approach that. A bird weighing about as much as 2 coins does it as a baseline requirement for winter survival. If mysteries like this fascinate you, this is exactly the kind of hidden world we dig into every week. The quiet, extraordinary intelligence hiding inside ordinary backyard life. Consider subscribing, because the next chapter goes even further into what these animals are actually capable of. Now, not every researcher agrees on how much of this is innate and how much is learned. That's the honest, unresolved part. Some evidence suggests caching ability is largely hardwired, present even in birds raised without caching parents. Other studies suggest young birds get meaningfully better with social exposure, watching more experienced individuals, refining their strategy over time. The truth is probably some blend of both, and scientists are still working out the ratio. There's a third layer to this that rarely gets mentioned outside academic papers. Competition changes the behavior itself. Field observations of caching birds show something almost sly. When a chickadee senses it's being watched by a rival while hiding food, it will often fake the cache, pretending to tuck the seed away, then quietly relocating it once the observer loses interest. That's not just memory, that's a working model of what another mind can and cannot see.
None of this happens in isolation from the body carrying it. A brain built for spatial precision is only useful attached to a flight system built for equally precise control. Consider the physical side of what these birds are doing at a feeder. The hover, the micro-adjustments, the instant course correction if a perch shifts under their weight. Hollow, reinforced bones. Feathers that function as both a rigid airfoil and a flexible sensor array, registering airflow changes almost like a whisker. None of that intelligence would matter without a body engineered over tens of millions of years to execute decisions in fractions of a second. What's not in dispute is the range of variation between species. Compare a chickadee to a pigeon. Pigeons, famously used in early homing experiments, don't rely primarily on caching memory. They rely on an extraordinary internal compass, integrating the sun's position, the layout of familiar landmarks, and quite possibly a magnetic sense we still don't fully understand. Two birds, two completely different cognitive toolkits, each shaped by an entirely different survival problem. Intelligence in birds isn't one thing. It's a family of separate solutions, evolved independently for separate lives. And here's the comparison that should genuinely unsettle you. In raw facial recognition tasks, some corvid species perform on par with primates, including, in certain experimental setups, on par with us. Not metaphorically, measurably.
A crow can distinguish one unfamiliar human face from another, retain that distinction for years, and respond appropriately based on whether that specific face was associated with danger or safety, which circles back to my feeder and the birds pausing to look directly at the lens. The most astonishing possibility, one supported by the mask studies and now replicated in multiple corvid populations, is that individual recognition in birds isn't limited to remembering. It can be transmitted. A crow that never met me could inherit caution or trust about me secondhand from a parent or neighbor who did, which means the reputation building at my feeder wasn't necessarily contained to the birds who actually visited it. It may already be spreading beyond what any camera could capture. We don't fully know how far or how reliably that social transmission travels. That remains one of the real unresolved mysteries in the field, the actual mechanics of how information moves between individual birds who never directly interact. Is it focal, behavioral, something closer to observational learning? Nobody has a complete answer yet. Think about your own relationship with birds for a second. The crows gathering on a wire outside your window, the chickadee that always seems to show up first at your feeder, the geese returning improbably to the same pond every spring. None of that was ever random. Somewhere behind those ordinary familiar sightings is a level of memory, recognition, and possibly even social knowledge about you personally that we are only beginning to measure. I think about the pigeons in city squares the same.
But homing pigeon research tells a very different story. These birds can be released hundreds of kilometers from an unfamiliar location and still find their way home with a consistency that outperforms most human-built navigation systems of the same era. If a pigeon in a park can hold that kind of internal precision, then the idea that it doesn't also recognize the specific person who feeds it every Tuesday afternoon starts to feel less like humility and more like an assumption we simply never bothered to test. Personally, I find that almost disorienting. I built a feeder to study birds. It's entirely possible the birds were quietly studying me back and doing it with tools more precise than I expected any wild animal to have. There's a quieter implication buried in all of this too. If recognition and reputation really can pass between birds who never met, then every interaction we have with a wild animal is potentially larger than the moment itself, a data point entering a network we can't see the edges of. Walk past the same crow roost every day for a year, and you may not just be observed once. You may be, in some small and largely invisible way, remembered by a population. Perhaps the most remarkable discovery here isn't the mask experiment or the caching hippocampus, or even the possibility that a crow somewhere has an opinion about my face. Perhaps it's simpler than that. We spent centuries assuming a small brain meant a small mind. The evidence now suggests the opposite, that intelligence doesn't need size, it needs the right design for the right life. And if recognition,
memory, and something resembling culture can exist in a creature that weighs less than a slice of bread, it raises an even bigger question waiting in the shadows of everything we've covered today. Because recognizing a face is one thing, but how does a bird that has never seen a map, never been taught a route, and never made the journey before, fly thousands of miles across open ocean and land without error on the exact same branch it left the year before? That mystery is where we go next.